welcome to Put Housing First. I'm your host, Andronika Morris, and I am here to talk to you today, as we do every Tuesday on WBOK 12:30 a.m., about what it means to put housing first. Thank you all for joining us. We hope everybody had a wonderful Thanksgiving. It was a little chilly out there. It was a little cold. And as always, when we have these, changes in weather, whether it's whenever we have these changes in weather, even if it's becoming hot, certainly when it's becoming cold, when it's raining, we always, it turns to mind what's going on with the unhoused, with our homeless neighbors and folks that who are unhoused or doubled up and struggling with housing security in the most basic ways. We know that most people who live in New Orleans can't afford to live here. They're struggling with housing insecurity, whether it's paying their utilities, paying their rent, paying their mortgage, certainly with this insurance crisis. All of that's gotten harder here in New Orleans and also across Louisiana. We're in the midst of a severe insurance crisis that has led to housing instability at almost every income band and at every level. Unfortunately, there are as much as many folks who struggle with this on a day-to-day basis, with housing insecurity, with paying their rent to keep their roof over their heads. There are our friends and neighbors who have experienced the worst version of the market, of this industry, of this issue. They are without a home, whether they're couch surfing, or they're double up with family, or the most vulnerable, folks who are street homeless. Unhoused, being homeless looks a lot of different ways for a lot of different people. There are about 4 categories, actually. There are 4 official categories that we at the Housing NOLA follow when we talk about whether or not somebody is homeless, experiencing homelessness. They are living in a hotel motel. They are staying in a shelter. They are street homeless, living in their car in an abandoned building, or they're doubled up. And we have more homeless children who are in the 4th category, where they're living with family and friends, couch surfing, doubled up, than there are the other 3 categories combined when it comes to homeless children. And that's the case for most folks. But we tend to focus on, and rightfully so, the folks who are street homeless. And as we promised last week, we were going to talk about what's going on with our unhoused population. We're going to have a special show for you next week, where we're going to have some of our partners from the city of New Orleans and Unity of New Orleans on. But today I'm really excited to have with us our guest, Attorney William Most, who's joining us today. William, hi, and welcome to Put Housing First.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me on the show.
No problem. I'm glad you could join us. We wanted you to come on today, William, because wanted to talk about something very specific, a very specific issue that's happening right now. Last week, we talked about Jeff Landry's attempts to make housing more expensive. He didn't think that that's what he was doing, but as he tried to raise more revenue for taxes, he was going to make it harder for people to repair their homes, and we were able to fight that back and beat that back. And we talked about what else happened in that tax session that is going to have long-term consequences. But Jeff Landry isn't only doing one thing at a time. It's like playing whack-a-mole, especially when it comes to housing. He has also taken extraordinary steps in the last few weeks to forcibly relocate the unhoused from some of the encampments. And you, William, you're representing some of the folks who are pushing back against this. Can you talk a little bit about what's happening? Give the listening audience a little bit of background and where things stand right now.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And this is good timing, because we have some breaking news. Just about 90 minutes ago or so, a judge issued an order that restricts what the governor's state troopers can do in that regard. But I'll back up and give a little bit of the backstory to give some context. So I'm a civil rights attorney here in New Orleans. We are teamed up with 2 other organizations. My firm, Most & Associates, is teamed up with 2 nonprofits, the Southern Poverty Law Center and the MacArthur Justice Center. And what we did is we first got involved when we learned right before the Taylor Swift concert that state troopers were going to conduct sweeps of encampments of unhoused people to clear them out of sight of tourists for that were coming to see Taylor Swift. And so we got involved on a very short-term basis. We were asked to help on a Thursday. We went to court the next morning, and we got an order from the judge saying that the state troopers could not move people, sweep them, throw away their property without some basic constitutional protections, like giving people at least 24 hours notice that this was going to happen, not destroying their property without a way to reclaim it or object to the destruction of it. And so that happened before the Taylor Swift concert. But then we've had a series of court proceedings after that, which resulted today in an ongoing order that similarly requires the state police to comply with the basic requirements of the Constitution. So that's the basics, but I can get more into it.
Yeah, I want to dig down around this because it was what we saw unfold the first time was extraordinary, right? And you know, there's a lot of moving parts inside of this, and I'm not going to rely on you to talk about those pieces. I can talk about the Home for Good program that Councilwoman Harris has been working on to help get folks relocated and help them find a permanent home using the resources that we have. The state has been a part of that in a variety of ways. But right before the Taylor Swift concert, a lot of us were appalled to see wildlife and game officials coming out along with state police to forcibly relocate folks, right? And not just moving them, but also directing them to another parcel of land where there are, you know, no restroom facilities or anything like that, and packing people up and moving their things. And that's what you all initially responded to, correct?
That's right. And that came up today because the explanation that the state police and the other agencies have been given is that, you know, we have to, for safety reasons, make sure people aren't under highways because it's not safe for people to be under highways. That was the explanation they gave to the court. But as the judge pointed out today, that doesn't make any sense because they moved people initially from areas under a highway to another location they had picked that was under a highway. It wasn't any safer. It wasn't any closer to bathrooms. It was out of the way of Taylor Swift tourists' view. And then last week, the state troopers started notifying people in the French Quarter that they would have to move to the location under the highway. So the explanation they gave in court, which is we have to get people out from under the highways, was completely the opposite of what they were actually doing, which was moving people from the French Quarter or trying to an area underneath the highway.
And the contradictions are astounding because the idea that people shouldn't have to look at human beings who are in distress, right? And this is for me as a philosophical standpoint. I know I'm always ready to go, well, wait, how about we just help them instead of moving them out of the way? Why in the world would we seek to treat human beings like they're pieces of garbage that just simply need to be put up and put away?
Yeah, that's right. And some of the language that the state troopers were using was pretty significant. So the notices that people were given at one point didn't say, you know, camping here is forbidden, or, you know, you're not allowed to stay here for long periods of time, or you can't set up a tent here. It said your presence here is a violation. And so that really highlights that from at least some people's perspective, it's the unhoused people themselves that are the problem, not what they're doing.
And again, it's also, I mean, what we believe at Housing NOLA and with our partners under the Put Housing First Triad, we believe that these are folks who are suffering the worst failure of the housing system, our inability to house them. We think that homelessness and housing insecurity should be treated the way we treat unemployment in this country. And it's funny because most people don't understand why the unemployment numbers are so significant, right? Why, as a country, from an economic analysis, the unemployment numbers are so challenging. It's not simply about people not wanting to work, even though a lot of people mischaracterize it that way. When you hear things like there's a significant disparity between, for example, in a place like New Orleans, the unemployment rate for African American men and boys than it would be for other folks. And people think, oh, that's proof that they're not working. They don't want to work. But what people don't understand is that the unemployment figure is people who want, the percentage is the percentage of people who are looking for work and the system can't accommodate them for whatever reason. So when you see a higher unemployment rate for people of color or any other minority group or for women, that is indicative of a systemic failure. It means not that those folks don't want to work. That's the percentage of people who are trying to find a job and the system can't accommodate them. That's what the unemployment rate is. And if we responded to homelessness as a failure of the system to house those folks. But what we hear and what we see and what you've been pushing back against is this nasty attitude that somehow those people are failing as opposed to the system.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, just because someone is living on the street doesn't mean they're not working. So some of the people who provided affidavits in this case, they have jobs. They just can't afford a house or an apartment. And
security
that's why
deposits,
it was such a problem.
Yeah, rent, utilities. A lot of the folks, particularly with this insurance crisis, have been pushed to street homelessness, have been pushed to this level of housing insecurity.
100%. And so when the state police came in and swept people's property away, some of the people were not by their tents or their belongings because they were at work. And so without providing notice, they may have returned back from a long night shift to find all their stuff was gone and destroyed. So these actions by the state troopers not only were illegal, but were also interfering with people's attempts to get back on their feet. And the city was working to find some of these people housing.
Right.
And that effort was interrupted by the state troopers scattering people, destroying their stuff, moving them from where their social workers knew where they were.
And so continuing with the chain of events. So you had the initial sweeps. You all got notified, you got engaged and went to court on Friday. I believe there was a stay, right? Or is that the right language? I'm not a lawyer, I only watch them on TV. So make sure I say it right.
Yeah, the judge issued what's called a temporary restraining order, which is a short-term emergency order.
A TRO, if I'm not mistaken, right?
That's right, a TRO. And so that lasted for a short period of time, a little over a week. And then we went back to court to say, well, Judge, this should be, turned into a longer-term order. And what happened then is the lawyers for the state got up and said, Judge, there is nothing to see here. The operation is over. There's nothing to enjoin. And so on the basis of what the state police's lawyers were saying, the judge said, okay, well, then I'm not going to issue a longer-term order. But then we found out very quickly that wasn't truthful. The very next week, the state police started planning their next operation of the same kind.
Wow.
And started passing out some flyers to tell people to move. So what they had told us in court wasn't true. And then that happened all over again. We got on the phone again with the judge shortly thereafter, and state police said, we're only going to be sweeping people from 4 specific locations, all of them on state property. And that wasn't true either. What we saw and what the state police admitted in sworn testimony is that they swept locations on city property and far more than the 4 that they said they were going to sweep.
Wow. So y'all went back to court and the judge issued another TRO, correct?
That's right. So we got another TRO, and then today the judge decided whether or not that short-term TRO should be converted into a longer-term order that will last for the foreseeable future.
And that's the breaking news. You got that.
That's right. So today, the breaking news is that today, Judge Julian listened to the arguments by the plaintiff's lawyers, which was the team of the MacArthur Justice Center, Southern Poverty Law Center, and Most Associates, and agreed that what the unhoused people here are asking for is not very extreme. They're not saying, they're not asking that the state police can't move encampments. They're just saying if the state police are going to move encampments, they have to follow basic constitutional requirements, not anything fancy, but the bare minimum of what the Constitution requires to respect people's rights to property, liberty, things like that.
And that's an important distinction, right? Because what has been halted is the shenanigans, right? The showing up and saying, because I'm wearing a uniform, because I got some boots on, because I got a piece of paper, you've got to get away from here, right? That's stopped. But they can come back with a different plan. But that one would require notice, right?
That's right. At least 24 hours notice. That has to be posted in a particular way. And there has to be a plan for taking care of people's property, because everyone has constitutional rights. Whether you live in a mansion or you live in a tent, you have a right to property.
Right. That's right.
Constitutional rights aren't just for rich people. And so the government can't throw away your stuff, destroy it, without basic constitutional protections.
Well, and I can't, and again, I'm not a lawyer, I only watch y'all on TV. The visceral reaction and community, I think this community has, despite the fact that as a society, we struggle with the unhoused, right? I think a lot of people are afraid of the unhoused, not necessarily from a safety perspective. I think they're afraid of how uncomfortable the unhoused make them, right? Because so many of us, again, most of the people who live in New Orleans can't afford to live here. And I think a lot of people look at the unhoused and are made uncomfortable thinking that that could be them. And most New Orleanians, most people who live in southern Louisiana are actually really, really, really uncomfortable with that notion, because we've all experienced some form of homelessness. If you've lived here in the last 19 years, you've been homeless. You've been unable to return your home because of a earthquake, not earthquake, Lord, because of a hurricane or a tornado or a pandemic or a boil order or a utility outage. Some kind of catastrophe has made it so that you either don't have your home or you can't access your home, which, guess what, makes you homeless. We know that. And it's the thing that also makes me know that New Orleans is ready to grapple this in a way a lot of people across the country aren't, because as uncomfortable as some people are, and we get a lot of NIMBY nonsense, we get a lot of elected officials in particular saying and doing incredibly outrageous and hateful things when it comes to the unhoused. But when push comes to this shove, this community goes, yeah, that's about some nonsense. Y'all need to stop that nonsense. When the council started entertaining the idea of preventing people from giving the homeless food, folks were like, yeah, no. That, like, and they tried to make the argument about trash and things like that, and everybody was like, one, we have rules about this already. People need to be doing better by the homeless. If you're going to provide them with food and resources, you need to clean up after yourself. You need to give them resources and food in a way that is respectful. We already have rules around that. You can't litter. That's not, like, we can't treat them like animals, saying don't feed the animals. This community pushed back against that. And I'm glad to say also, this community was incredibly outraged and indignant about what you all were mobilized around the fight with. The folks coming together, MacArthur and Southern Poverty Law Center and you, William, coming together. Y'all did that at the behest of the community. Community was like, can y'all help us with this? Can y'all help these folks? Can y'all protect them?
Yeah, that's right. And I think, there's questions about, what does the law require and what is a good way of handling a problem?
Right.
And the state police approach here was neither, right? It was
correct.
Neither constitutional nor a good way of handling the problem, because this problem is not solved by taking people from all different locations into the city, squeezing them into one dark, dirty area under a highway out of sight, and then just hoping the problem goes away. So, we're hoping that the state realizes you cannot just put people in a dark corner and hope the problem will go away. But at the very minimum, you have to follow what the law and the Constitution says if you're going to try and disrespect people's property rights.
And that's a big piece that I think is part of the reason folks viscerally react poorly to this. As uncomfortable as the unhoused make us sometimes, the idea of someone coming in and taking the little bit these folks have and treating it so disrespectfully, throwing it away as if it's trash, throwing and what you're saying about them, and for some of them, you're talking about like they threw away tents, right? That was the little bit of shelter that person had, and you just discarded it.
Yeah, or HIV medication or people's social security information. So
Their
taking
paperwork.
away the means of people taking care of themselves, staying healthy, and getting access to services were all interrupted by some of these actions.
And that is so right now what's happening is so congratulations, first of all. Thank you all so much for the work that y'all have done on this. It's fantastic news, and I'm glad you were able to break it here on WBOK 1230 AM to talk about where this was. We're so excited to have you on here. And so now the state is going to, I mean, I'm certainly hoping, I know we're going to talk to hopefully some of the folks at the city and at Unity to talk about next steps, because a process was interrupted. The city, the Home for Good program was actually trying to help folks. And one of the things that we heard from those program administrators and those program managers is that this scattering of folks is detrimental because, one, they're not animals that you can pen up somewhere. They are human beings. So you move them and you said this is the designated spot. For whatever reason, they may not, they get to have agency. They have agency. They're human beings. They may say, I'm not going to stay there. I'm not going to stay there. They don't have to. But that also means that if their case manager was trying to find them, the state has also interrupted that and made that difficult, more, if not made it impossible.
Yeah, that's right. And so, this action by the state police was so disruptive for so many reasons. And I think, the judge understood that, is that there was a real impact on people, that even losing something small that is not worth a ton of money is a big loss if you don't have the ability to replace it, or you don't have the ability to easily, shop online and have something shipped to your door. Losing something small can be a big deal when you don't have much. And so the judge understood this is a real impact on real people. And so at the very least, the state should have to follow bare minimum, not the Cadillac plan of notice and property rights, but the bare minimum of what is needed to respect people's rights.
That's right. That's right. And one of the things that's so bonkers to me about that is, again, we should understand that any of these folks in the state's office who live in South Louisiana, we've gone through this. Your home everyone has gone through this. Your home either taking on water because of flooding or because of a tree falling in your yard or something. And most of us experienced catastrophic damage 19 years ago with Hurricane Katrina. I remember having, funny story, I just got my Social Security card reprinted.
Mm-hmm.
Just got it. And part of the reason it took so long was it was hard. Initially, I was very, regimented about replacing certain things and making sure I had certain things because I lost everything when Katrina's floodwaters swarmed, took out the city. I lost everything except for the clothes on my back, the things that I had taken to sleep in my parents' den. And I was fortunate. I was one of the fortunate people. I didn't lose my job. I was able to work remotely. I was sleeping in a house that had utilities and internet and cable. And I went home. I was able to go to my first home after losing my second home. And my original, my childhood home, I should say, after losing my adult home. And a lot of people didn't have that. But going back and trying to get those documents redone and how hard it was. And I kind of gave up. I was like, well, and I didn't need it was the other crazy thing. It wasn't until I needed my Social Security card that I was able to do it relatively simply. But originally, there were a lot of obstacles. There were a lot of barriers. And how can our state be a part of traumatizing people? Why would we want state sanctioned disasters?
Yeah, yeah. I think that's right. I mean, we expect the government to help us when we are subject to a disaster, not to be the disaster itself causing the problem. So,
Correct.
I hope this is a wake-up call that, regardless of rich or poor, mansion or tent, Cadillac or a bicycle, you have rights. Everyone has rights, and the government has to respect them. And if they don't, then they may have to deal with a situation like this, with a judge ordering them to comply with the basic constitutional protection. So we really appreciate everything that the community has done for this, because this really has been a team effort between community groups on the ground, advocates for unhoused people. The press has been covering this, and then, the legal team of Southern Poverty Law Center, MacArthur Justice Center, and Most Associates. It's been a team effort to make sure that basic constitutional rights are respected by the state police and other entities.
Exactly. And again, that's what community and how these systems are really supposed to work. And we need our elected officials. And again, I got to remind everybody, we're always talking about this here on Put Housing First, what it means for our leaders to recognize this as not simply a catchphrase or the name of our radio show or campaigns that we work on, but how they need their responsibilities as it relates to building a just and equitable society. When policymakers tell you they can't do things like guarantee housing, everybody should be thinking about the fact that, but for some strange reason, you can be a state-sponsored disaster. You can be, if you can be a force for ill, for a force for harm, why can't you turn that into being a force for good? What do you think is harder about creating housing opportunities and making them available for these same citizens who you would seek to move around as if they were chess pieces, as if they were, inanimate objects? Or one of the things that I found so offensive, I'll be frank with you, William, when they sent wildlife and game agents, I was outraged.
Yeah.
And all of us have those personal little things and issues like this that are like, this isn't really germane, Andronika. Yeah, but it's really freaking annoying.
Yeah.
That they would send, maybe they're not busy. Maybe the wildlife and fisheries folks aren't busy. I'm from the country, though. So I'm like, I think y'all got stuff to do. I think
that's a really good point, which is that none of this is free, right? It costs money to send out state troopers and fisheries and wildlife agents and DOTD agents. That's all taxpayer money being spent to make the problem worse, not better. And if that money could be spent instead on solutions rather than making the problem worse, we'd be in a much better spot.
That's right. That's exactly right. It's like, if you all, what aren't you doing that you should be doing? And I know that this governor is one who's big on reducing the size of government. Well, how about doing stuff ain't nobody asked you to do? Why are you doing things ain't nobody asked you to do? That seems like government overreach. That seems like wasteful spending. You're doing something that nobody asked you to do. And in his defense, I'm sure that there are some people who thought that Taylor Swift's fans, the kind of people who would spend money to put a friendship bracelet on the Superdome, who might think that investment of resources also means that those people shouldn't have to look at the folks that we have failed. And that's their calculation, right? So maybe, I'm sure somebody asked them to do this, but the people of New Orleans didn't ask him to do it. Those people don't get to speak for New Orleans, no matter who they are and what they think about their place in the universe. The people of New Orleans speak very clearly and consistently, and they yes, I think unreservedly, and we've seen this demonstrated time and time again. The people of New Orleans do want the problem of housing insecurity, of homelessness addressed. They want it ended. They do not think that ending that problem means making the people go away.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And so I hope that people, in this city will, contact their representatives and their leaders to speak out about this, because this is the beginning of a process. It's not the end, at least, just with regard to this lawsuit. This lawsuit is an ongoing project, and it doesn't end here. So, we appreciate the help that everyone has provided. We look forward to continued process here, and that we hope the state will do better in the future. And, I have to jump off in a minute, but I really appreciate you having me on the phone to talk about this, because it is such an important issue.
Thank you so much, William, for joining us. And you started to say it, and I just want to make sure we put a fine pin on it. Is there anything else community can do, the listening audience should be doing to get ready for this? We're going to have the folks from Unity in the city's Office of Homeless Services on, hopefully on next week's show, so they'll get some more concrete notions. But is there anything that you and the MacArthur Center and Southern Poverty Law Center need from the listening audience for them to do beyond, like calling our council members? I think is an important one. Yeah. Calling the state reps, and particularly, I'm gonna call out one state rep who had the temerity to applaud this despicable cause of action. Anyone who lives in Alonzo Knox's district needs to call him and tell him and ask him, has he lost his mind, and can we help him find it? And pressure needs to be applied, because not only was this just a gross miscarriage of justice, as we saw, that was clear. The judge said, yeah, you can't do this way. It's a waste of resources. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of the three agencies that were brought to bear on this could be doing things to actually help the people of New Orleans, the people of Louisiana, and not harming them directly, not state-sponsored disaster, visiting state-sponsored disasters on the people of New Orleans.
Yeah, I'm a lawyer, so I focus on the lawsuit, but I do know that elected officials listen to the people who elect them, and so, but they won't have anything to hear unless people make their voices heard. So contacting your representatives at the city, state level, there's certainly not a lot of downside, and when people understand that the community is in favor of solutions and not making the problem worse, then that may be a first step towards a solution.
Well, thank you, William. Thank you for all your hard work. Thank your partners for us. Thank you for being on with us with Put Housing First. We're going to have you back in a couple of months probably to talk about this issue. I doubt it's resolved, even though you all did get a victory today. We're so grateful on behalf of our neighbors and our friends, and that's somebody's family that y'all served today. So great job, and thank you for living up to the ideals of what it means to put housing first.
Thank you so much.
All right, William. We'll have William back. William Most, Attorney William Most, who just signed off with us today to talk about this issue and give us that breaking news that we heard, that there was a ruling in the case around and permanently enjoining the state of Louisiana from taking the despicable actions that they have been taking of summarily relocating folks to holding pens, basically, without notice, with simply picking up people's possessions and moving it out of the way without giving them the chance to have proper notice. That stopped for today. Judge Julian has ruled and made that temporary restraining order permanent. You heard it here today from Attorney William Most, who talked about what that battle looked like. It turned out it's been going on for a few weeks now. And one of the justifications, interestingly enough, was initially this was brought about around Taylor Swift. last week, in a bit of culture war nonsense that this governor practices a lot, he tried to make this next sweep, this next roundup, this next targeting of our friends and neighbors who are unhoused, who have who are experiencing the tragedy of being street homeless, in the name of the Bayou Classic. So, trying to make it like, Taylor Swift, trying to make it about, well, no, we're not simply doing it for the tourist. This is a time-honored tradition. This is a part of New Orleans' culture. And the visitors who come to New Orleans for the Bayou Classic, as if they needed some kind of protection from the folks who, again, are experiencing homelessness. And they moved again in a similar way after saying, hey, nothing to see here. We're not going to do this anymore. The original TRO needed to be allowed to lapse. The judge went along with that, but then they came back less than 2 weeks later with the same antics. And now, because of that pattern, because of those pieces, they have been permanently prohibited from moving in the same manner, where they are not giving proper notice, where they're simply summarily just moving people around and trying to pen them somewhere else. They have been stopped from doing that. That does not mean that this governor and these folks who are aiding and abetting this, whoever's pushing the state to do this, who's ever calling on the state to do this, they need to hear from you. They need to hear that this is not how you want this handled, particularly when we know that our service providers here in New Orleans, the programs that have been stood up here in New Orleans, have been making headway to get folks housed. Now, is that system perfect? Nope. But I think everybody would argue that that's better than what has been happening, than people going in and sweeping them away. Just even the language that they're using, homeless sweeps, they're not pieces of trash. You can't sweep a person. Clearly you can. You shouldn't. You shouldn't be sweeping a person. And one thing that I'm going to continue to talk about when we talk about what it means to put housing first, we're talking about what it means to put people first, right? The housing is foundational to what it means to be a part of this community. You are a Louisianian because of where you live. You're a New Orleanian because of where you live, where you grew up, where you want to be, who you want to be, how you want to build your community. And we want everyone to have that, right? We want everybody to have that chance, that opportunity. That's what Put Housing First means. That's what we do at the organizations that make up the Put Housing First triad. That's what we're talking about every week, every Tuesday on WBOK 1230 a.m. That's what we're talking about, what it means to put housing first as the foundation of a society, the foundation of a city. And most people get that, right? New Orleanians in particular. It's one of the reasons why I always say, when asked, people will ask me, who's closest to getting this right? Who's closest to figuring this out? Because one of the things that I will be frank about irritates me is we have, often our policymakers, in an attempt to, shift responsibilities, people will go like, well, we need to know how to do this, right? And so, who can we follow? Who's got a good handle on this that we can follow? Because, and what's unspoken in that is the notion that, we can't do it, right? Like it's not something we know how to do. So surely we want to follow some experts. We want to follow the lead of communities that have been successful at it. And my answer always back to those folks is New Orleans is. New Orleans is on the cutting edge of transformational housing investment, transformational housing policy, transformational power shifting. New Orleans is. New Orleans is leading on these issues. And the people of New Orleans demonstrated that beautifully almost a month ago. On November 5th, when you looked around nationally, not just at the bizarre outcome of the presidential election, and it really wasn't bizarre. It's a different kind of tragedy that's going to unfold, a slow moving disaster that we all got to get ready for. But it was also, we saw a lot of housing initiatives take a beating. We saw a lot of initiatives around building just and equitable society get knocked down. Everything from abortion rights, actually be have the people show up and say what they wanted, and then have the system come back and push them back. Everything from North Carolina's their legislature, they flipped their legislature, and then their existing legislator has actually passed measures in the lame duck to try to negate all of those changes. Florida passing, going the way that it did as a state, and having 57% of people vote in favor of abortion being a codified right, but having the governor and the folks who put that ballot measure on rig the system so that they needed 60% of the vote. It's as opposed to a majority plus one not being enough. No, it needs to be this arbitrary 60% needs to be the threshold for getting that done. And in other places, and in New Orleans said, yeah, we want to make sure that we're spending our own money. We're not going to tax people. We're going to invest money. We're not going to allow our leaders to continue to mismanage resources. We want to build in accountability. We want to build in protections. We want to designate trusted partners, and we want to hold them accountable. The city of New Orleans decided to invest in a housing trust fund almost a month ago today, and said, yeah, we want that. You are going to do that for us. And not just at 51%, 50% plus one person, not at 51%, not at 60%, 75% of the folks who turned out on the November 5th ballot. And we had an incredible turnout, almost 60% of registered voters. I think it's a little over 60%. I need to check the final numbers of folks who were eligible to vote in the city of New Orleans showed up and said overwhelmingly, our leaders must invest our resources in our community, in what the basic building block of community, our homes. We are telling you to help keep us housed. We're telling you you're going to create housing opportunities for us to keep us here, to grow this city, and to make sure that we are what's important. We are the foundation. And that change was enshrined into this city's charter, its home rule charter. So we didn't just say, let's spend some one-time money, which would be extraordinary. You saw ballot initiatives and simple realignments, have not worked in the past. And here the issue is so significant and so severe, and people are so clear about it. People are ready to, if the opportunity is presented to them in the right way, if it's set up correctly. And they stood up and said, we're not going to talk about simply trusting our leaders. What we saw on November 5th here in the city of New Orleans was a clear, cogent demand for better. A clear, cogent demand that our leaders take the resources that we have, and 2% is the minimum, right? That's like the smallest amount available, but it was more than what we were requiring be spent, which was zero before. So 2%, that's 2% more than we were spending, to the tune of, it could be anywhere from $17 to $20 million in new money for housing every year in perpetuity. New Orleans is closer to solving this problem than anybody. Everybody is struggling with this issue, particularly with the needs of the unhoused. California has almost as many unhoused people in the state of California as voted on November 5th to guarantee housing money be available in perpetuity in New Orleans. Those are real numbers. That's a real thing. It's a real point of comparison. And it's not that California isn't doing good work. There's a lot of inconsistencies, particularly from their leaders. And community has not been able to be as clear with them. New York City, same thing. There's a clear need. They've just not been able to clearly articulate to those leaders. Austin, Nashville, Miami, you name a place. We can walk you through where there's been this back and forth. And New Orleans was not much different. We have a New Orleans City Council and a mayor's office that have spent months arguing over a single apartment to mixed results around it. And when you look at good policies like the Healthy Homes Initiative, where there's a real need when it comes to things like dealing with the Willows, the apartment complex in New Orleans East, where we've actually got state policy that's going to push the owner to act better. And then we've got our own local policies to do that, but we were missing key components like relocation funding for the folks who are trapped there. So we've passed policies to target the owners, to shut them down, to comply, to compel to compel them to act according to the contract that they have signed, right? To say you signed a contract with this family, you signed a contract with this person to provide them with housing if they provide you with rental money, and what you're providing them with is substandard, so we're going to put you out of business. But we're missing a key component, because if all we do is shut that business down, we have created more homeless people because they're there because they don't have anywhere else to go. And that's one of the things that we keep seeing, is that we're pushing folks out of New Orleans. We're pushing people out of Louisiana. And, you know, sometimes we think, well, that those are folks making choices, or those are folks living with the consequence of their choice. It's way more complicated than that. They're living with the consequences of our collective choices. They're living with the consequences of our leaders' failures to make good choices. And what we have started to practice here in New Orleans, where New Orleans is leading, is that we are starting to practice accountability when it comes to housing. And I'd love to, you know, while we take great pride here at Put Housing First and at Housing NOLA and the other partner organizations on education, the community has done the hard work, and the community has done the hard work to ignore some of the distractions that our leaders throw at them. There's a part of me that thinks that the homeless sweeps, particularly on what they've been tied to, who probably called for them, right? What parts of the community, and as much as those folks who would think that, who have the power to, who benefit from Taylor Swift's coming, who benefit from the Bayou Classic, not because of what it means to the people of New Orleans from a cultural standpoint, what it means to the people of New Orleans from an economic standpoint, but what it means to them purely for their pocketbooks. And they think that makes them powerful. They think that that makes them more important than you or I. And that's how they can call upon the governor and persuade the governor and get elected officials to say absolutely hateful things about your neighbors and my neighbors and our friends who happen to be experiencing a tragedy of being unhoused. They are suffering as a result of this system's failure to house them. And all of us aren't responding to this way. So these folks, instead of responding to homelessness the same way that they respond to the unemployment rate and recognizing that it is a systemic failure, they're blaming the people, they're blaming those folks, and they're saying this is going to affect my pocketbook. So they call their friend the governor and say, you got to do something about this. You got to get these people out of here. And the governor's like, oh yeah, I need to distract folks from something that I'm doing. and let's see if they're going to fall for it. Let's see if they're going to give us permission to come for them next. Because that's what Attorney Most and their partners at Southern Poverty Law Center and the MacArthur Center push back against. For those individuals, for those folks expressly, they defended them, and that is extraordinary, and I can't thank them enough for that work. And we need more efforts like that. Some, great partners. We've got another number of other partners in legal aid, Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center, Southeast Legal Services, who also often show up for these kinds of fights as well. We need that defense. But what everybody needs to be really clear about is they were talking about this was whether or not this community responded and how we responded was also whether or not we were going to respond when it was our turn, right? So what's different from, moving someone who from their tent, from their home, this place that they have carved out for themselves? What's different from, when there's when we need to push people out of New Orleans because we're not making it safe, because we're not making the appropriate investments to make it safe. And let me be clear about that, right? So because you get people starting to argue about safety, and we don't want to, and we're certainly not fighting for the unhoused to remain unhoused. We want them to find housing. We need to provide them with housing. But that's why they need to leave. That's why they need to no longer be on the streets, because we have served them, because this market accommodates them. But when there are these market failures, when there are these disasters, be it state-sponsored disaster or natural disaster, how do you want your government to respond? How do you want your leaders to respond? Your leaders should respond in defense of you. Now, clearly, we've got good legal teams who can stand up and respond. But the next step is for our city and local officials, for the policy entities, as well as any organizations who can be a part of the solutions. They've also got to respond. And we've got to hold them to that. We've got to make sure that we've got relocation assistance, that we've got homes and apartments for folks to go to that respect their needs, that respect these folks as citizens and accommodate their needs. That means if they got pets, got to find some place for them to go with pets. They got children, got to find some place for them to go with their children. They've got special needs. They need those needs. That home should meet those needs. And they shouldn't take anything less than that because we're giving it to them. We owe each other more than that. That's what it means to be in community with each other. And we can do it. It's possible. There's another important reason that New Orleans is closer to solving this problem than your New Yorks and your Miamis and your San Franciscos and your Austins and your Nashville, because we actually have enough room for everybody who's already here. Got plenty of room. Don't let anybody lie to you. Don't let anybody trick you as you're struggling to pay your bills and struggling to pay your insurance and struggling to pay your utility bills. I'm not negating that struggle. I'm telling you that struggle is not rooted in scarcity. I'm not telling you what I think. I'm telling you what I know. This is a math issue. There's more than enough room for all of us who are here right now. There's more than enough room for everybody who's under the bridge. And there's more than enough room for everyone who wants to come home, who is still not come home 19 years after Hurricane Katrina. That's what it means to put housing first. And that's what we're talking about every week on WBOK 1230 AM. And that's what we'll be back to talk about next week. More about what that means. So I'm your host, Andronika Morris. We'll be back next week to talk about, hopefully we're going to talk to our friends at Unity in the city of New Orleans to continue talking about this, because it's that time of the year. And we want to make sure that everyone has a safe holiday season and everyone has the joy and peace of being safely housed in a home that sustains them. Again, we'll be back next week. I'm your host, Andronika Morris. Y'all take care of each other out there.